Well, I want to return now to the expulsion of those Russian diplomats. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Alexander Vershbow, joins me now. He is also the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Great to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Linda.
Despite this worldwide effort to expel Russian diplomats, intelligence officers, there are many analysts who believe it does not go far enough. What's your reaction?
Well, I think it's a very significant response, particularly because it's a united response by the transatlantic community. 22 nations are imposing these same expulsion penalties on the Russians. And for President Trump, it's a big advance over where he has been in terms of his relationship with Russia. It's the most substantial punishment he's decided to apply. That being said, I think we could go further. This certainly will put a damper on some of their intelligence collection capabilities for the short and medium term, but the spies can be replaced. There's plenty more where these came from. I think it would have much more of a dramatic effect on Russian calculations if the administration went further and imposed some financial sanctions, targeted on some of the Kremlin cronies that are part of Putin's power base. They would feel the pain. They would understand that supporting a regime that supports aggression of this kind, using nerve agents against NATO countries, is going to put Russia into into the international doghouse. They'll be a pariah for a long time to come.
Ambassador, we know that President Trump last week spoke to President Putin, congratulated him on his re-election in what was essentially a one-man election in Russia, against the advice of the White House. Why is he so torn when it comes to wanting to be seen as a friend of Putin, but also, I guess, reluctantly agreeing to this diplomatic punishment? Why is he so torn?
Well, there's something that we don't really understand, even after several years, as to why President Trump is so soft when it comes to criticizing President Putin. And congratulating him on his election victory wasn't really appropriate, because it was a fake election. There was no real opposition. The only viable candidate was excluded from being on the ballot. That being said, we do have to work with the Russians, no matter how seriously concerned we may be about nerve agent attacks or the hacking of our election or what they've done in Ukraine. And so I think he wants to keep the door open to dialogue. But I think he's strengthened his credibility a lot by supporting this decision. I hope it wasn't reluctant. The White House is saying that he was quite committed to this decision. The test will be whether he's prepared to go further if Russian provocative behavior continues. Financial sanctions, which have been authorized already by our Congress, would be, I think, a much more effective move than just expelling some diplomats and spies.
We've heard, of course, from Russia. Russia's ambassador to the UN called this global move to expel diplomats unfortunate and unfriendly. But the Russian ambassador to the US went even further, calling it a grave mistake. And I'll just read a statement he said. He said, "I consider these actions counterproductive. I said that the United States did a very bad step, undercutting little what we have in Russian-American relations. These decisions are going against the telephone conversation between our two presidents." So clearly they are seeing this very public diplomatic standoff, and then these private behind-the-scenes conversations between President Trump and President Putin. What's your reading of the situation now between relations between the US and Russia, and what do they need to do to work together going forward?
Well, what the ambassador said isn't surprising, and I think it reflects a little bit of shock that President Trump did authorize a much harsher response than they perhaps were anticipating after that reasonably friendly phone call. But he's right that the relationship between the United States and Russia, between the West and Russia, is at its lowest point in decades. But we also have to remember that it's mainly Russian behavior that has brought us to this level. In the invasion of Ukraine 4 years ago, changing borders by force for the first time since the end of World War II, trying to interfere in our elections, through hacking, through disinformation. All these things add up, and the Russians have to look themselves in the mirror and recognize that they are responsible for a lot of the problems, and they have to be the ones that start to rebuild by de-escalating. Getting out of eastern Ukraine would, of course, be the first thing I could suggest. But that's just one of many steps that they need to take.
All right, Alexander Vershbow, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Great to get your perspective. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.